certain aspects of this score can become vexing and worrying to those who play it. The lure of writing pieces which stretch the limits of the performer may go some way towards explaining this. It's hard to imagine Brendel's limits being stretched by anything. He's famously mostly self-taught and seems to have arrived in his brilliance completely fully formed. At the age of 14, he was digging trenches in the final days of World War II. Just 4 years later, he won the Busoni competition. This is not a man who was easily challenged, and yet there was one piece which may have shaken the very foundations of his artistic practice. One which has been mostly absent in many recent obituaries and tributes, but one which shines a particular light on what made Brendel just so remarkable. Schoenberg's Piano Concerto. This divisive work was incredibly important to Brendel, so important, in fact, that he recorded it twice, 36 years apart. And he believed that this was not only a great masterwork, but that it might have something crucial to say about the world that we live in. Re-recording the work recently with the same orchestra and conductor 36 years after my first attempt felt like an act of regeneration, as though I were contributing some continuity and progress to a world which, relapsing into nationalism, fascism, and madness, appears to have lost interest in both. Brendel wouldn't have played, and certainly wouldn't have revisited, works that he didn't care deeply about. And in this work in particular, he believed it held an antidote to some of the world's darker impulses. And he wasn't the only pianist to feel this way. Gould took it up as well. He was a longtime fan of Schoenberg, maybe because the music was as difficult and contrarian as he was. Mitsuko Uchida also speaks reverently about this work, her recording having gone down in legend for its unforgettably fiery and romantic approach. But what sets Brendel apart is the lifetime that he spent with this work, his connection to the work's history, and the openness with which he invites us into this frightening but inspiring world. Why should masterpieces necessarily be popular? He asked, identifying this concerto as a problem piece.
It was a great problem in the first 10 years to get a good performance, and now again it is incorporated in the repertory.
But for him, this was a problem worth solving. The piece, far from collapsing under the strain of its tensions, proves its resilience. All that being said, I have to be totally honest right up front that I don't find this to be a terribly easy piece to listen to. At some points it made me feel physically almost sick to my stomach. It was so strong. It isn't a piece that I could listen to half-heartedly or in the background. It demanded my attention, and it wasn't always a pretty experience. But that's exactly why it mattered to Brendel so much, even as it pulled at a problem at the core of his artistic identity. You don't need to like this piece, but if Brendel gave decades of his life to it, then I think it's worth listening to with open ears and an open mind. And if you, like Brendel, believe that it's important to mix both rigorous investigation as well as fun, emotional intensity, then I suggest that you subscribe to the channel and like this video. It's also part of my philosophy to keep bringing you informative and fun, but deeply researched videos here on YouTube for free. Brendel could often be mistakenly characterized as a pianist who put brain over heart, but for those of us who have taken the time to listen to his recordings, we know that to be quite far from the truth. We know how meaningful every note really is in his playing. But in a funny way, that misunderstanding links him directly to Schoenberg, another artist who was often mistakenly seen as a caricature of artistic coldness. It feels like everybody hates Schoenberg. His development of 12-tone serialism, where rows of 12 notes form the basis for a piece rather than traditional harmony, is often blamed for killing the development of classical music composition in the 20th century, for turning it into an intellectual exercise rather than an expressive art. The man died almost 75 years ago and still can't escape the allegations. At best, he's seen as a provocateur responding to the horrors of the 20th century. At his worst, a deliberate charlatan who set single-handedly to destroy Western classical music. But just like Brendel, if you look a little bit closer at his life and listen a little bit more freely to his music, you'll hear that this story doesn't quite hold up. Behind the reputation is a man whose work was grounded in a search for new structures of meaning and expression. Someone who believed himself to be firmly within the Romantic tradition. Someone for whom Strauss was the greatest composer of the 20th century, and someone whose identity, both artistically and personally, put him at odds with the world around him. In 1934, with fascism overtaking Germany and Hitler rising to power, Schoenberg, who was Jewish and whose avant-garde music had already been categorized as degenerate by the regime, was forced to flee Europe. There was no future for him there. He made his way to the US, settling in Los Angeles, where he would remain for the rest of his life. He never returned to his homeland. Indeed, he had more privilege than many other refugees of the time, but this upheaval left lasting damage. His health was poor, and while a few American musicians knew who he was and even admired him, he was far from beloved. Concert opportunities were rare, and his music was largely misunderstood. Schoenberg's tragic relationship with LA continued this year when hundreds of thousands of his scores were lost in the Los Angeles fires. This is why it was so notable when, in 1940, one of Schoenberg's occasional students, Oscar Levant, commissioned him to write a short piano piece. Levant was the archetypal Hollywood pianist, friends with celebrities, skilled at jazz and show tunes, and when he asked his teacher for a new piano piece, he thought he was commissioning something nice and modest, an easy $1,000 for the commission. What he got instead was a full-blown piano concerto. Chill, super chill. Suddenly, this small piano piece burned feverishly in Schoenberg's mind, and he decided to write a piano concerto. However, I wasn't prepared for a piano concerto. The fee grew to a vast sum for which, as the dedicatee, I was promised immortality. It's honestly such a classic Hollywood moment. Can I get a 2-minute piano ditty? Sure! But it didn't matter too much what Levant was thinking. Schoenberg was already off the leash. This was his first piano work in nearly a decade, and it marked a sharp departure from the strict formalism of earlier pieces like Opus 25. Which is shaped after a Baroque dance suite. In fact, for some of Schoenberg's most loyal, most avant-garde disciples, perhaps this piece was even a bit too expressive. A few of them accused him of going soft, saying that perhaps he spent a little too much time in the California sun. What they didn't understand, however, is that this was poetry rather than prose, written in the language that Schoenberg himself pioneered. He insisted that music should tell a story, that it should emerge from a poetic, narrative impulse. He would tell students, in composing even the smallest exercises, the student should never fail to keep in mind a special character. A poem, a story, a play, or a moving picture may provide the stimulus to express definite moods. The pieces which he composes should differ widely. The concerto is written in 4 movements, each of which carries a title which may signal what Schoenberg was thinking about while watching his homeland's descent into chaos. Life was so easy. Suddenly, hatred broke out. A grave situation was created, but life goes on. That final statement, but life goes on, when I hear that, I think of Schoenberg's kind of resignation, his sense of alienation at being in this sunny, beautiful paradise of Hollywood, while many of his friends and loved ones were experiencing the absolute worst of fascism in Europe. Eventually, the concerto was premiered, not by Oscar Levant, but by one of Schoenberg's fiercest allies in the US music scene at the time, Edward Steuermann, with the NBC Symphony Orchestra and Leopold Stokowski conducting. A fierce and individual interpreter, Steuermann had long championed Schoenberg's music and understood its expressive logic from the inside. Steuermann had also been a student of Busoni, who himself had written an overlong and musically complex concerto just a couple of decades prior, so I would say he knew what he was getting himself into. Steuermann also was, of course, one of Brendel's great inspirations, so it makes sense that Brendel would also be drawn to this concerto. Now, before we get into Brendel's recording, I need to tell you a little bit about how this piece is constructed. Thankfully, I have the Wikipedia article printed out right here, and I'm going to read to you all about the 12-tone technique behind the piece.
The piece features consistent use of the 12-tone technique and is made of the trichords of the hexachords, tetrachords, dyads, and right here we have there is no fifth movement, but right here we have we would have found the four dimensional.
No, look, I could certainly sit here and read to you and explain the full theoretical hoo-ha behind this piece, and there's a time and a place for that, absolutely. Don't get me wrong, it can be quite interesting, but I don't truly believe that it's necessary to have a visceral understanding of this piece. In fact, in my experience, the audiences who are most open to the music of the 20th and 21st centuries are the ones who haven't been told what they're supposed to hate yet. They're able to listen without preconceived notions of what music should or shouldn't be. Just like you don't need to understand synthesizer technology to be transported by Dark Side of the Moon. You don't need to know how to use Blender to enjoy the gorgeous textures in a film like Flow. And you don't need to have completed 4 semesters of keyboard harmony in order to be wrecked by a single phrase of Brahms. It's the same with Schoenberg.
Ich glaube, Schoenberg hat das alles ausgedrückt, weil es war in ihm, es hat in ihm gekocht und so. Aber wenn wir das hören, müssen wir nicht daran denken. Wissen Sie, jeder Mensch hat eine andere Reaktion zu dem gleichen Stück Musik.
12-tone serialism wasn't meant to be a trick of arithmetic, printing out pieces as though we were writing them in Excel spreadsheets. It was, in many ways, meant to be a kind of alchemical tool suited for mysticism and the creation of magic. Brendel himself explicitly stated that it wasn't necessary for a listener to understand the full architecture behind this piece. The unifying impact of musical material often remains indirect, whether in Beethoven or Schoenberg. What the listener ought to notice is the masterly control of the melody's seemingly casual unfolding. The appearance of a kind of C major at the end of the initial melody and at the conclusion of the work briefly recalls Stravinsky's use of harmony, which makes simultaneous use of tonic and dominant. So you don't need to understand the architecture behind this piece in order to appreciate it. But of course, knowing something about music theory is essential for any aspiring musician. If you are curious to go further with some of these more theoretical and technical ideas, then I encourage you to check out Eric Wen's keyboard harmony class on tonebase. It's a great course whether you're just starting out or if you're like me and you spent most of your undergrad memorizing motets and learning about medieval music history instead of learning the really fundamental elements of music theory. That's totally a me problem. You can get access to this lesson for free as well as a helpful PDF with tips and exercises by clicking the link in the description below.
The performer has a responsibility to respect the wishes of the composer. And it's not just following the dynamic markings or all those notations that he puts in, but it's really to illuminate the essence of a piece of music.
All that being said, I do think it's helpful to hear the 12-tone row that this piece is based on.
That is the tone row. It's very soft.
When a pianist as wonderful as Uchida plays it, these 12 notes sound like they're so full of potential. They lead us towards surprises and resolutions, promises which may never come true.
Is retrograde inversion.
In Brendel's rendering of this piece, he invites us to follow this piece like it's a story, in the way that perhaps Schoenberg really intended for it to be listened to.
Schoenberg conceived the first movement of his piano concerto under the heading "Life was so easy." Then this will perhaps deter the performer from playing it all too lyrically and dreamily.
He advises us to follow the melody as it transforms, to attune our ears to contrasts rather than resolutions as the key aspect of this work. I suspect that Schoenberg did have Oscar Levant in mind while he was writing this, even if this wasn't the piece that Levant was anticipating. Some of the passages in this work sound almost like demented Gershwin, or like the most feverish film scores of Bernard Herrmann. About the mind-bending cadenza in the third movement, he writes, "It asserts the position of the pianist as the center of musical proceedings. The despair and terror of the gestures in these 12 bars bring to mind images from Picasso's Guernica." Brendel's choice of Guernica is incredibly intentional. The painting was made as a kind of anti-war protest after the bombing of civilians during the Spanish Civil War in 1937. When Guernica was being painted, Schoenberg was already living in exile in the United States, and Brendel, only a child, was about to grow up into a Europe ravaged by war and fascism. When Brendel hears Guernica in those 12 bars, he's of course making a connection between two of the great expressionist masters of the 20th century, but he's also listening for how horrors echo throughout history. He's intentionally reminding us that perhaps we're closer to these kinds of horrors happening again than we would care to admit. It was Schoenberg's ambition, strange as it may seem to some, to bring the functions of the heart and the head together as closely as possible. This moment also points to the paradox at the core of this piece, the thing that made Brendel call it a problem piece, the thing that challenged the core of his artistic identity. This piece is incredibly difficult, to the point of impossibility.
Schoenberg's piano concerto is a lot of brain work that you need, and then there are awkward places because he did not play the piano very well, so he did not know how to write effectively for the piano, and he has no intention of writing effectively or comfortably, so it lies very bad at times, and you really have to jump about or the hands are getting into each other.
This presents an irreconcilable problem for Brendel, who believed that a masterpiece should reveal to the performer what to do, and for Schoenberg, who believed that the performer was merely a servant to the wishes of the composer. Of course, Brendel knows this, and he acknowledges what happens when head and heart don't quite work together. While I am constantly reminded of the emotional urge in Schoenberg's music, there are details which make me feel that, at points, the clarity of his head was clouded by the urgency of his heart. Of course, Brendel loved this piece, and he lived with it for decades. Eventually, he was able to find a kind of peace in all of these contradictions. I have learned to reconcile and to be consoled by the fact that this musical organism is sturdy enough to carry its warts. Followers of great composers may compose more impeccably, but smooth finish is not often found in the style of great works. In them, spots and blurs may be accepted or even cherished as imprints of genius. Listening to Brendel play this, knowing how much he's internalized the physical challenges, how much he understands the theoretical, technical complexity of the work, and yet how he's filtering it through pure emotion, it's impossible to hear anything other than music, not numbers, not systems, but pure expression. And perhaps listening to this piece, we hear Brendel at his most romantic. Feeling is the alpha and the omega of the musician, the point where music comes from and the point to which it has to return. I think Brendel is a pianist whose playing can easily be described as sublime, as beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. He understood better than almost anyone that music's job isn't always to soothe or to be enjoyable. Sometimes it's meant to wake us up to all of the immensity of the world around us. His performance of Opus 111 is a prime example of this. It's not comforting. It pushes us right to the edge of mortality and holds us there with tension and sublimity. When I listen to it, I often feel the same physical reaction that I have when I listen to Schoenberg. That feeling which, by the end of the sonata, eventually evaporates into transcendence and a sense of immortality. The infamous philosopher Teodor Adorno, who of course is quite controversial and has many problems that we will not discuss today, once speculated on why Schoenberg's music presented such a problem both for the audiences at the time that it was written and the audiences in the present day. The opinion that Beethoven is comprehensible and Schoenberg incomprehensible is an objective deception. And if you recall, Brendel said almost the exact same thing. But anyway, back to Adorno. The general public, totally cut off from the production of new music, is alienated by the outward characteristics of such music. The deepest currents present in this music proceed, however, from exactly those sociological and anthropological foundations peculiar to that public. The dissonances which horrify them testify to their own conditions. For that reason alone do they find them unbearable. What Adorno is saying is that Schoenberg's music, in all of its thorny, dissonant craziness, makes us confront the difficulties of our own life, the very challenges of our society as they exist around us. It's not something we always want to hear when we go to a concert, but it's exactly this that Brendel was so passionate about in this piece. He understood that it was essential for art to point to war, to fascism, to all of the horrors of the world around us as a way of possibly helping us to heal. Brendel wasn't afraid of challenging his audience with his interpretation, something that was occasionally misunderstood and quite controversial during the peak of his career. And Schoenberg's music is quite an excellent medium for doing just that. In his excellent biography of Schoenberg, Malcolm MacDonald summarizes his entire oeuvre quite well, saying that his pieces may bewilder, satisfy, or annoy, but no one can afford to remain indifferent to them. They raise questions at so many different levels, challenge preconceptions, force us to think. With their graphic exploration of emotional extremes, their will towards clarification and refusal to entirely despair, they chart a passionate man's 20th-century pilgramage. This almost sounds like it could have been a description of Brendel's entire interpretive ethos. In Schoenberg, Brendel found a composer who he could spar with intellectually, and one who was exploring the depths and complexities of the human experience in music as much as he was. Brendel understood that an unpopular masterpiece could still be an essential part of the repertoire, and he found that in Schoenberg's Piano Concerto. Through the legacy that Brendel has left us, through his writings, his interviews, and his performances of Beethoven, Mozart, Schubert, Liszt, Busoni, Schoenberg, and beyond, we're able to get closer and closer to this truth, one recording at a time. Thank you so much for joining us today to celebrate Brendel's legacy through the lens of this horrifying and beautiful and marvelous work. What is your favorite Brendel recording, and what's your favorite performance of the Schoenberg Concerto? Some absolutely phenomenal pianists have performed it. I really enjoyed listening to the Uchida recording as well, and hearing her talk about this piece is just an absolute treat. Don't forget that if you were craving more in-the-weeds discussions of the ins and outs of music theory, then you can get Eric Wen's tone-based course for free by clicking the link in the description below. Whether you are a music theory expert or just getting started, this course will help you bring those skills to your piano playing. I'm Robert Fleitz from Tonebase, and I'll see you next time. This is not a man. This is not an artist. This is not a human. As the dedicatee, I was promised immortality. I don't know why he suddenly has a New York accent. I'm sorry, it's like 100 freaking degrees in this apartment and I'm starting to lose my marbles. Should I improvise a 12-tone row? Ba 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 ba. Did I get all 12 notes in there?